Hello, my name is Maayan. I'm the candidate for False Creek with the BC Green Party, and welcome back to Questions and Answers with me. So thanks for submitting these questions. A lot of them were, like last time, quite hard, and I had to look into them, but a lot of the answers are now from the BC Green Party platform, and I'll make sure to say what's from the platform and what's just my opinion. So here we go. From Dela, how can BC improve its approach to reconciliation and UNDRIP? So I haven't been able to look at the platform points for this because I think they're coming out today. So this is kind of what I think. I think BC needs to take more clear steps to aligning its actual practices and laws with UNDRIP. Adopting UNDRIP was a huge and positive step, but we need to figure out what it means to implement that meaningfully. So that might mean recognizing hereditary leadership in some cases and doing more within the legal system to actually integrate Indigenous legal traditions into the colonial legal system. And that's ongoing work that has to happen within the legal system. Because of the history of colonialism, there's been a huge erasure of Indigenous systems of law and governance, and an attempt to totally replace those with colonial law and governance. Including the Indian Act Chief and Council system. But that doesn't mean that those legal traditions don't still exist and can't still be developed and recognized and integrated more into the Canadian legal system. As far as development projects go, we need to take opposition to these projects more seriously. And that's recognizing the complexity of these things. There's disagreements between Indigenous nations about development projects. There's disagreements within Indigenous nations about development projects. It's not black and white. But a lot of those disagreements, in my opinion, come from the neglect of economic development in those communities and the huge amount of poverty that's prevalent in remote Indigenous communities. So the fact that an elected chief and council system is supporting a development project, it doesn't mean that that's the only viable way forward for that community. And we need to also listen to those families and house groups that are standing in the way of these projects and are envisioning a different way forward for their communities and for their nations. So none of these things are simple, and they actually require relationship building and time, and they can feel very confusing and messy from the perspective of colonial institutions. But that's the actual work of accountability and education and relationship building that needs to happen before reconciliation can take place. So here's a question from Sarah. What about people who work in extractive industries or the fossil fuel sector, especially in rural areas with few job alternatives? Won't the Green Party put them out of work? So the Green Party came out with a more comprehensive platform on this just this week. And it talks about implementing a just transition program for workers in the oil and gas sector and other industries. So to allow these people to transition to a guaranteed job in a clean economy. And in order to do that, the BC Green Party is promising to establish a clean jobs program, which will be aligned with recovery from COVID-19, to get people back to work who have had to stop working because of the pandemic. So that program would create jobs in enhancing BC's natural assets, in tree planting, in habitat restoration, in remediation of environmental liabilities, and in climate adaptation. So that program would serve a double purpose of putting people back to work, helping guarantee jobs for people in rural communities, but also moving us towards our climate and ecological goals. And the BC Green Party is also planning to expand the Clean BC Better Buildings program and making it a job creator. And so that's sort of an equivalent in a more urban setting, which has to do with retrofits and code efficiency requirements and improving the built infrastructure within urban communities so that buildings are efficient and not having such a large footprint ecologically, but that we're also using that need in order to create jobs. Here's a question from Nikki, and they're asking, what climate change-related initiatives would the Green Party push in agriculture and forestry, around regenerative agriculture or forest fire management? Well, around forestry, this is just from the platform. The Green Party is basically advocating that as a public sector, as British Columbians, we need to take some control back of our forests from major corporations and make sure that the forestry that's happening is meeting the needs of local communities from an economic and ecological point of view. And that's recognizing that forests are actually a public resource, and we're giving away some of these forests too cheaply to large companies, and they're not being managed holistically enough. And we can have a sustainable forestry industry, but we can't just liquidate natural resources for the benefits of shareholders and for massive corporations, even while local jobs are being shed from mills. So that's just not sustainable. And we need to manage those forests both for biodiversity and obviously to protect the old growth forests that are left completely and stop logging those entirely. Around agriculture and food security, we've seen with COVID that we can imagine supply chains being disrupted. Right now our food system relies on really long supply chains that are very complicated, and we need to be prepared to be more resilient on a local level for disruptions in those supply chains. And so establishing long-term food security might mean decreasing reliance on those import supply chains and having a more localized version of providing our basic staples. That doesn't mean that trade isn't going to be important. It is, but we need to think more about the balance between trade and supplying our own basics here in British Columbia. So that involves a bunch of different things. One is expanding the area under food production and creating publicly owned agricultural land bank that would be available to lease by new farmers, recognizing that there's regional disparities in food insecurity across BC and working to enhance food security, especially for low-income British Columbians, as well as developing systems that are specifically tailored with First Nations and honor Indigenous knowledge and values about food security in Indigenous communities. Incentivizing agroecological farming practices, and which means supporting farms to adopt technologies to reduce carbon emissions and enhance the habitat quality on their farms. And obviously funding research and establishing regional agricultural bureaus that can provide expertise and extension to farmers about innovation. And this area is pretty close to my heart because it's related to what I did my PhD about. And I learned that there are good solutions for sustainable agriculture, some of which are localized, some of which still depend on international supply chains and trade. Both are going to be important, but overall, the more people that are involved in the agricultural sector in BC that are actively stewarding and working on the land in BC, the better off we're going to be in the long run. So a question from Lucy. How can progressives seeking greener alternatives to the NDP rely on the Greens to be inclusive and supportive of trans, Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities, as well as promote socially and economically responsive legislation and policies with regard to health, education, housing, and services? Okay, that's a big question. And I'll just reflect from a historical or social science perspective first, before saying sort of where we sit within that. So historically, green politics have existed on a spectrum, both on the social and economic axis. So on the economic side, green politics can exist from economically leftist positions that emphasize the role of the public sector in shaping society equitably to more right-leaning, or like what people call turquoise green approaches that emphasize market-based approaches to addressing environmental concerns, but they usually de-emphasize economic equity or the distribution of wealth. Both of the approaches are valid and they need to be used for different things, in my opinion. As you'll probably see from the Green Party platform, it's more on the socially democratic sort of left-wing side of that spectrum economically, and generally the BC Greens want to leverage and sometimes expand the role of the public sector, both through regulation and outright ownership of services and economic sectors, to take away influence from bad actors in the private sector. So, for example, in seniors care and forestry, in the fossil fuel industry, those are all areas that the BC Green Party is advocating for a bigger role for the public sector to take control back and have actual value generated for the public in that, rather than for shareholders or for owners of large corporate entities. On the social axis, green politics also range across the board, or they can. So from inclusive and very socially progressive politics that realize and recognize how intersectional oppression works and seeks to end that, all the way to like eco-fascist ideology that actually blames usually brown and black people for overpopulation and environmental ills. I think I can speak pretty strongly for myself and the Green Party when I say that, like, my understanding of the global ecological crisis and the exploitation and despoiling of ecological systems is very bound up with my understanding of how white supremacy, colonization, and corporate oligarchies have also exploited and targeted human beings, typically non-white people and women much of the time. And so I think that all of our work has to be through the lens of equity and justice, not just preserving ecology for its own sake in a sort of isolated way from human beings. But that's an ongoing education process, I think, within green politics. And there's real tension sometimes in green politics between like nature lovers, I guess, and then people that are looking for justice through a more human lens. And it's a conversation that we need to keep having and naming environmental racism whenever we see it. So Evie is asking, how will the BC Greens as a provincial party work with cities and municipalities on their issues like transit and housing prices? Well, I looked into the Green Platform on municipalities and transit and housing, and it's pretty comprehensive, so I'll just try to summarize here. The BC Greens want to work with municipalities and modernize municipalities' revenue models as well. Right now, the things that municipalities can use for revenue and what they can spend money on is very restrictive, and so the Green Party is talking about modernizing that so that municipalities can do more things, because they really are central in a lot of these policies around housing and livability of communities. But the provincial government has a huge role in all of this, and so the Green Party supports expanding access to diverse types of housing, including co-ops, extending leases, and creating a land bank for new co-ops, working with governments to expand the sort of missing middle types of housing like townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, having a capital fund to support the acquisition and maintenance of rental properties through a nonprofit model, and closing different loopholes in speculation tax that allow too many foreign owners to be exempt from those taxes. And in terms of renting, there's also policy around closing the gap between affordable rent and what renters are actually paying. So for the renters that are paying more than 30% of their income For housing, there's a grant that would be means tested that's been promised in the platform, and generally, as far as livability of cities, the Green Party supports active transit, increased public transit, pedestrian-only streets, and the development of all of the types of infrastructure that we know that people enjoy and that actually contribute to climate mitigation in cities as well. Okay, that's all the questions that I have today. And thanks for listening to my very long-winded answers, but these things are complicated and hard, and so these are the kinds of questions that we need to talk about a lot and not just have little sound bites to address. So thanks so much.